Today, I want to break down what that actually looks like from a relational and psychological standpoint. When we talk about love, it's important to understand that it doesn't exist in just one form. Research in attachment and relationship psychology shows that love can show up in multiple layers. There's the more intense, chemically driven experience that people often describe as passion-based attraction. That early-stage feeling can be powerful, fast-moving, and emotionally consuming. It often feels like instant chemistry, like everything is heightened and accelerated. But that version of love is not always built on deep relational understanding. In many cases, it's more about emotional activation than emotional intimacy. It's not necessarily that you truly know the other person yet. It's that you are deeply impacted by how they make you feel in the moment. That kind of connection can feel exciting, even overwhelming, but it doesn't always reflect long-term emotional stability or deep relational bonding. Now, individuals with avoidant attachment patterns often relate to that early-stage intensity in a complicated way. On the surface, they may appear to engage with it. In some cases, they even mirror it. They might seem emotionally available, expressive, or highly interested at the beginning of a relationship. But internally, this stage can feel uncomfortable or even unfamiliar over time. In many situations, avoidant individuals learn to perform a version of emotional connection that aligns with what they believe relationships are supposed to look like. So they may temporarily step into that fast-moving, intense dynamic. However, as things begin to slow down and require deeper emotional presence, something shifts internally. Because for avoidant attachment styles, real emotional depth is not something that feels immediately safe or instinctive. What actually begins to matter more to them over time is consistency, emotional safety, trust, and a sense of stability within the relationship. That is where authentic attachment begins to form for them, not in the chaos of early intensity, but in the slower unfolding of reliability and emotional predictability. And this is where things become more complex. When an avoidantly attached person starts developing genuine love, it does not usually present itself in dramatic or overly expressive ways. In fact, it often looks subtle. It builds gradually through familiarity, through repeated experiences of safety with one person, and through moments where emotional pressure does not feel overwhelming or demanding. But at the same time, this is also the stage where many avoidant individuals begin to struggle internally. Because the very thing that creates real attachment, closeness, consistency, emotional dependence in a healthy form, can also activate their fear of losing autonomy or becoming emotionally exposed. So even when they are developing deeper feelings, there can be an internal push-pull dynamic happening at the same time. Part of them is drawn toward closeness, while another part instinctively steps back when things feel too emotionally intense or too vulnerable. This is one of the key reasons relationships involving avoidant attachment can feel confusing from the outside. The emotional progression is not linear. It doesn't always move forward in a steady, predictable way. Instead, it can fluctuate between connection and distance, engagement and withdrawal, warmth and emotional detachment. What many people misunderstand is that this withdrawal is not always a sign of a lack of feeling. In fact, in many cases, it can occur precisely because feelings are developing more deeply. As attachment strengthens, the emotional stakes increase, and with that comes a greater internal awareness of vulnerability. From a clinical perspective, authentic love for an avoidantly attached person is not defined by intensity or early chemistry. It is defined by endurance, emotional steadiness, and the ability to remain present even when closeness begins to feel uncomfortable. Another important aspect to understand is that many avoidant individuals carry internal beliefs about love that are shaped by early experiences. These beliefs often include the idea that love should either feel completely self-contained and independent, or it should feel overwhelming and unstable. Because of this, balanced, secure love can sometimes feel unfamiliar or even difficult to interpret at first. So when they begin to experience something more stable and emotionally consistent, they may not immediately label it as love. In some cases, they might even resist that label internally, not necessarily because the feeling isn't there, but because accepting it requires emotional vulnerability and acknowledgement of dependency, which can feel threatening to their internal sense of control. This is also why development in avoidant attachment takes time. What looks like emotional hesitation on the outside is often an internal process of recalibration. They are slowly learning that closeness does not automatically equal loss of independence, and that emotional reliance does not have to mean losing themselves. Over time, when the relationship is safe, consistent, and not emotionally coercive, something very important begins to shift. The avoidant individual starts to stop viewing love as something that takes away from them, and instead begins to experience it as something that adds stability to their life. And that is often the point where deeper attachment becomes undeniable. Not because of intensity, but because of emotional grounding. Still, even at that stage, there can be moments of resistance. Emotional intimacy can trigger old patterns. Distance may still show up. But what changes is the return. The return becomes quicker, more intentional, and more emotionally aware. Because authentic love for an avoidantly attached person is not about never pulling away. It's about learning that connection is still there, even after distance, and that closeness does not have to be abandoned in order to feel safe. And that is the deeper emotional reality that many people miss when they try to understand avoidant attachment only through behavior, instead of looking at the internal emotional experience driving it. This is when something important starts to shift internally, even if it doesn't look obvious from the outside. In many cases, what people interpret as sabotage in avoidantly attached individuals isn't random or meaningless behavior. It often happens right at the point where emotional intimacy starts to feel real, stable, and unfamiliar in a good way. In other words, when the connection becomes healthier, more consistent, and more emotionally grounded, that is often exactly when internal resistance can show up. Not because the person doesn't care, but because part of them is registering the situation as emotionally significant in a way they were never fully prepared to tolerate long-term. And this is why the timeline is usually much slower. These patterns don't unfold quickly. They build over time through repetition, trust, and emotional exposure that doesn't feel overwhelming or unsafe. So what I'm going to go through now are some of the behavioral signs that often appear when an avoidantly attached person is actually moving toward deeper, more authentic attachment. If you are in a relationship with someone like this, or you recognize these patterns in yourself, these are often indicators that something real is developing beneath the surface, even if the behavior itself feels confusing. And just to be clear, these responses are not perfect proof of anything on their own. Attachment is complex. But when you see them consistently over time, they can point toward deeper emotional investment. One of the first signs is honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. In avoidant attachment, honesty can be complicated, not because they don't value truth, but because early experiences may have taught them that being fully honest about needs, preferences, or emotional boundaries can lead to conflict, rejection, or emotional backlash. So, in many relationships, they may initially hold back or soften their truth to avoid disruption. But when genuine attachment begins to form, something changes. They start valuing the relationship enough that they no longer want to distort reality just to keep things smooth. That's when you may notice a shift. They begin telling the truth more directly, even when they know it might not be well received. They might clearly express what they don't want, what they're uncomfortable with, or what they disagree with. And even if it creates tension, they don't immediately withdraw from the conversation. Because at that stage, honesty becomes a form of respect. It's their way of treating the relationship as something real, not something fragile that needs constant managing. The second sign is respect that becomes more visible and intentional. As attachment deepens, avoidantly attached individuals often start to show respect in more consistent and tangible ways. This isn't just general politeness. It becomes a more grounded acknowledgement of who you are as a person. They may begin recognizing traits in you that they don't necessarily share or even prefer, but still accept without trying to change them. Instead of subtly resisting differences, they start to integrate them. You might notice them acknowledging your habits, your standards, or even your quirks in a way that feels more observant and appreciative. Things like your discipline, your intelligence, your way of organizing life, or even your personality traits start to get verbal recognition. Not because they are trying to impress you, but because they are beginning to see you as a stable, whole person rather than a temporary emotional experience. And in many cases, they may even adopt small elements of your structure or mindset, not out of dependency, but out of respect and influence that naturally develops through closeness. The third sign is emotional openness that begins to emerge gradually. This is often one of the most meaningful shifts, but also one of the most misunderstood. Avoidantly attached individuals don't usually move from emotional distance to full vulnerability in a sudden or dramatic way. Instead, vulnerability tends to appear in layers. It starts small, sometimes almost unnoticeable, and builds slowly over time. At first, it might be subtle disclosures, sharing opinions that feel slightly more personal, or revealing thoughts they would normally keep private. Then it can progress into sharing past experiences, internal conflicts, or emotional reactions they usually regulate on their own. What makes this significant is not the content itself, but the willingness to be seen without immediately shutting down or retracting. Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, vulnerability is not just about opening up. It is about tolerating the emotional exposure that comes with being known deeply by another person. And when they begin doing that consistently, it usually signals that trust has reached a level where the relationship no longer feels like something they need to emotionally defend against at every moment. That is often where deeper attachment is quietly forming, even if the person themselves doesn't fully recognize it yet. So what often happens at that stage is that what looks like sabotage from the outside is actually a form of internal conflict, showing up right when the relationship becomes more emotionally real, more stable, and more meaningful. And it's important to understand this clearly. When an avoidantly attached person is moving toward authentic love, it doesn't always feel smooth or linear. It tends to unfold slowly, with hesitation, corrections, and moments where they try to regain emotional control. Not because they don't care, but because the level of attachment they are experiencing is deeper than what they are used to regulating. So I want to continue breaking down some of the behavioral patterns that often show up when an avoidantly attached individual is actually developing genuine emotional investment in their partner. If you're in a relationship with someone like this, or you recognize yourself in these patterns, these are often subtle indicators that real attachment is forming beneath the surface. One of the key signs is sharing frustration and small personal details that don't seem emotionally significant on the surface, but actually are. Avoidantly attached individuals are not typically comfortable with unnecessary emotional disclosure. So when they start sharing everyday frustrations, personal opinions, or small details about their inner world, it may not seem like much at first. For example, they might mention something like how frustrating their year has been with taxes, or how a document is delayed and it's stressing them out. Or they might casually bring up something from their childhood, like a memory of a favorite game they used to play. To most people, these might sound like ordinary comments. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, these are actually small openings. Because what they are doing, without always realizing it, is letting you into parts of their internal world that they usually keep private. And that level of casual self-disclosure is often a sign that emotional safety is increasing in the relationship. The next important pattern is being action-oriented instead of emotionally performative. In avoidant attachment, Words alone are rarely how love is expressed when it becomes real. In fact, promises and emotional declarations can sometimes feel uncomfortable or even unreliable to them. Instead, their emotional investment tends to show up through behavior, structure, and correction over time. So rather than saying, "I'll never do this again," or making emotionally charged promises in moments of conflict, they are more likely to shift into practical accountability. For instance, imagine a situation where a couple has an argument. One partner becomes overwhelmed, emotions escalate, and something is said in frustration. Maybe a raised voice, maybe harsh wording that doesn't reflect their true intent. Afterwards, the avoidantly attached partner becomes aware that their behavior had an emotional impact on the other person. In that moment, they might not respond with dramatic reassurance or repeated apologies. Instead, they tend to acknowledge responsibility in a more grounded way. Something like recognizing what they did, accepting that it wasn't aligned with who they want to be in the relationship, and then focusing on what needs to change moving forward. But the real shift happens after the conversation ends. They begin adjusting their behavior in practical ways. They might start communicating more about their daily stress instead of internalizing it. They may become more intentional about recognizing triggers before they escalate. They might actively implement new coping strategies so that emotional overload doesn't get redirected into the relationship. This is what emotional repair looks like in avoidant attachment. It is not centered on reassurance, it is centered on change through action. And often, this is a very strong indicator of genuine care, because they are willing to modify their internal patterns rather than just offering verbal comfort. Consistency in presence and behavior over time is often one of the most revealing, yet most misunderstood, indicators of emotional attachment in individuals with avoidant attachment patterns. On the surface, consistency can look simple. It might seem like routine communication, predictable replies, or small daily habits that repeat over time. But within avoidant attachment dynamics, consistency carries a much deeper psychological meaning than it appears to from the outside. To understand this properly, it's important to first recognize how avoidantly attached individuals typically function when they are not emotionally invested. In those cases, their engagement with others tends to be more flexible, situational, and often dependent on convenience or immediate interest. Communication may come in bursts, followed by distance. Interaction might feel irregular, not necessarily because of disinterest in a negative sense, but because there is no internal structure binding them to maintain ongoing emotional presence. However, when genuine emotional attachment begins to form, something subtle but important changes internally. Their behavior starts to become more organized around the relationship. Instead of connection happening only when it feels convenient or emotionally neutral, it begins to take on a sense of structure. The person gradually becomes more predictable in how they show up. This is where consistency begins to emerge as a meaningful indicator. It might appear in very ordinary ways at first. For example, they may begin sending a good morning message without missing days, or they might check in at night as part of a developing routine. Sometimes it shows up in small updates throughout the day, not necessarily long, emotional conversations, but simple signals of presence. These actions may seem minor in isolation, but their significance becomes clearer when you look at the pattern over time. What makes this behavior important is not the emotional intensity behind it, but the reliability of it. Consistency is not about how expressive they are in a single moment. It is about how repeatedly they choose to remain connected across time. For individuals with avoidant attachment, this shift is significant because their natural tendency is often toward autonomy, self-containment, and emotional independence. Their internal system is generally structured around minimizing emotional dependency and maintaining a strong sense of personal control. Because of this, they are typically selective about what they allow into their daily routine, especially when it comes to people. So when someone begins to appear regularly within their schedule, not because they are being pressured, but because they are naturally integrating them into their life, that indicates something meaningful is happening internally. The relationship is no longer being treated as optional or external. It is becoming part of their emotional structure, even if they do not consciously label it that way yet. This is why consistency is often a stronger indicator of attachment than emotional declarations or intense moments. Avoidantly attached individuals may not always express feelings in a direct or verbal way. In fact, they may even struggle to identify or articulate those feelings in real time. But their behavior tends to reveal what their words do not. As the relationship continues, they may not immediately recognize that what they are experiencing is love. Instead, they might interpret it as routine, habit, responsibility, or simply being in contact with someone important. The emotional labeling often comes later, after the behavior has already stabilized. Only with time do they begin to look back and realize that their consistent engagement, their willingness to adjust their schedule, and their ongoing presence were all signs that attachment had already formed at a deeper level than they initially understood. Another important aspect of this pattern is that consistency in avoidant attachment is not random. It is selective. It is not applied evenly across all relationships. It is reserved for individuals who have become emotionally significant enough to warrant integration into their internal structure of daily life. That selectivity is what gives consistency its meaning. It is not just about showing up. It is about who they choose to keep showing up for. And over time, this consistency becomes self-reinforcing. The more regularly they engage, the more familiar the connection becomes. The more familiar it becomes, the safer it starts to feel. And the safer it feels, the less internal resistance there is to continuing the pattern. This is how attachment gradually deepens in avoidant dynamics, not through sudden emotional breakthroughs, but through repeated behavioral reinforcement. Eventually, what may have started as small, simple routines becomes a stable part of their emotional world. At that point, the connection is no longer experienced as something external that they visit occasionally. It becomes something integrated into their sense of normalcy. And that is often when deeper emotional bonding is truly taking shape, even if it is quiet, gradual, and not always consciously recognized in the moment. Because for avoidantly attached individuals, love is rarely defined by intensity or dramatic emotional expression. It is defined by continuity. It is defined by what remains stable over time, what is chosen repeatedly, and what becomes part of their life without requiring constant emotional negotiation. So when consistency is present and sustained, it is often one of the clearest signs that attachment is no longer hypothetical or distant. It is already unfolding in real behavior, even if the emotional understanding of it is still catching up.